Thank you for coming to our session on closing the gap through the PYP. My name is Kirsten Wickman. I am a PYP coordinator in Fridley Public Schools. Fridley is a northern suburb of Minneapolis. And I'm going to let my colleagues introduce themselves. We're going to start right on time because we've tried to pack about 2.5 days worth of stuff into 75 minutes.
Hi, welcome. My name is Heather Shrunk, and I am a second grade teacher at Stevenson Elementary School, which is in Fridley, Minnesota.
Hi, and I'm Nancy Gerber, and I'm a PYP coordinator at Lincoln Center Elementary School in South St. Paul, Minnesota, just on the other side of the Twin Cities. And I'm going to try to get this thing back in here, because I need to use both hands. Kirsten and I attended a workshop at the Science Museum of Minnesota, and in their professional development department. They're nationally known for their work in access and equity in STEM fields. So we noticed in this workshop that their framework was really a lot like the PYP. And in fact, we believe that if we teach the PYP with fidelity, that it is really a great tool for access and equity and for closing the gap. And we'll talk about that in the next 45 minutes. The Science House tells us that in order to make a change in academic achievement, that we need transformational change. And in order to have transformational change, we can't just slip out a piece like a new curriculum or maybe technology, that it really requires a cultural systemic change in your school and organization. And so that's the kind of thing that we're talking about now. They have a model that is very similar, and for your use, we have their framework on this handout. We put it in nice little boxes for you instead of this round version. Their model is called the Framework for Access and Equity. There are 5 lenses, and we're not going to talk about all 5 today, and we're not going to talk about them in order. But in general, lens 1 is about inequities and disparities, gathering data and examining our beliefs, and perhaps that's like collaborative planning in the PYP. Lens 2 looks at curriculum and pedagogy. That's like teaching and learning, approaches to teaching and learning. 3 are the STEM subject areas, science, technology, engineering, and math. And the standards documents and the relationship to the broader culture. Lens 4 is identity and personal belief, and 5 is community, that learning happens in community and that the solution to the gap will also happen in the community. In the plenary sessions, they were talking about the gap and disparities, and they're certainly documented in our school data and also in the national press. This graph is just one example of NAEP data for math in 4th grade on a national level. Minnesota is a state with a huge achievement gap, and our school in particular is a large public elementary school, and we have been identified as contributing to that gap. So we are really interested in making that change. So this lens 1 with beliefs, values, high expectations, and ability tracking provides insight into changing the school demographics and the kinds of policies we have, like ability grouping, that might be enforcing the disparities and inequities. High expectations refers to the belief that all children can learn. And certainly in IB schools and in all schools, we are here to make the world a better place and believe that all children can learn. But the data sometimes says that they're not all learning. So what is that difference? A longer workshop would provide time to examine our beliefs and values about teaching and bump up against some things that we might not be aware of. But for today, we're just going to look at the beliefs of learners. And a review of the learner data often leads to reflection in lens 4. But before we go there, John Hattie wrote a book called Visible Learning for Teachers, and he did a meta-study of over 900 variables that affect teaching. And a point 4 is neutral. And so anything with an effect size of better than 0.4 makes a difference. And the thing that made the most difference for kids, the biggest effect size, was student expectation. Student expectations about their own learning. And for us, that relates to self-theories. So self-theories relies on the work for us, on the work of Carol Dweck. And so I'm going to introduce Carol Dweck's work to you now. Click. Thank you for being patient. Carol Dweck is a social and developmental psychologist who's currently a professor at Stanford. She's developed a theory about mindset and intelligence based on 40 years of research. She provides evidence that when people are faced with a challenge, they respond in one of two ways, either with a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. A growth mindset views intelligence as malleable, changeable, and that with effort you can get smarter. If you have a fixed mindset, it's you are what you are and you get what you get. And that it is uncontrollable, unchangeable, it's just who you are. So now we're going to listen to Carol talk about her work.
I think I've always been interested in the question.
She was very articulate a few moments ago. If we're going to abandon Carol, I can move on. We can abandon Carol. Oh, gosh. Well, I would go to YouTube and listen to Carol Dweck talk about herself. She talks about how in her 6th grade class, her teacher arranged desks by IQ. Yeah. That's a good response. And she didn't want to lose her place. And so that in that class, it was all about looking smart. And she would give impossible tasks to 5th graders, these puzzles. And some of the kids, about 40% of the kids, would say, oh, this is interesting, give me more. And 40% of the kids would just say, oh, this is too hard, and I give up. And so that was the basis of her work. She did a number of research studies like that. You want to try her again, or should we just keep going? All right. Bye, Carol. So often when students learn something quickly, we say, oh, you're so smart, good for you. And because when something comes easy, we assume that they're gifted, that they're truly smart. Even the word gifted implies that you were born with a gift of this intelligence. And struggle is considered a bad word, that if you have to work hard at it, that you're just not smart enough. However, in any field of study, things are going to get hard, and to be innovative, that you would have to struggle. And Carol Dweck encourages having students struggle. It's something to value rather than, and promote rather than to avoid. And with a constructivist learning environment in the PYP, really we're asking kids to have that tension and struggle with a bit of tension. So these are, the significance of mindset doesn't really make a difference until you have a challenge, and one of those common challenges is middle school. And these are the questions that Dweck used in her research with 7th graders in New York City. As kids went to middle school, their grades started to decline. So she had 2 groups, and they taught one group organizational and study skills. The other group had organizational skills, study skills, and mindset training. They were taught that intelligence and being smart is a choice, that you get better by trying, and that your brain can grow as you continue to work and struggle. So after 8 weeks of half-hour sessions, the kids with the study skills group, the control group, their grades continued to decline, and the kids that had the mindset grades went up and continued to stay that way. And there are a number of studies in her book called Self-Theories that can document her work. But I want to tell you a story about struggle that I just recently learned. And so many of you may have heard of Sugata Mitra. 4 years ago, he knocked a hole in the wall of his software company in India. And so these street kids had access to the computer, and they had it really low, so only kids could work at it. And so for 4 years, they documented this work, and these kids were learning a great deal. And so the graph shows that the kids, the blue graph, the kids that had access to the computer learned a great deal, and the kids, the control group, on the other hand, sadly lost scores on their test. So he decided that he would take this a step further, and he took a computer to a very remote village in India. And he gave the kids, like Carol Dweck did, an impossible task. He said, well, I don't know what you do with this thing, but the question he had was about the structure of DNA. And it was all in English, not their native language. And he said, well, just good luck, see what you can find out. And he went away for 2 months, and he came back, and he asked the kids, well, what did you learn? And they said, nothing. And he thought, oh, well, they did nothing. He said, except that we need a faster processor and a new mouse, and that we learned that if you're not careful when you replicate DNA, that you might get some deformities. And they said it in English. So he was going to leave again, and he asked a 22-year-old in the village, he said, well, can you help these kids out? And he said, no, I don't know anything about DNA. He says, well, what you need to do is just stand behind them, encourage them, and go, wow, how'd you know that? What did you do there? And the kind of feedback that you would get from a grandmother who doesn't really understand what you're doing, but just loves you and wants it to go well. And so he came back in 2 months, and this feedback increased their scores by 50%. So he won the TED Prize for $1 million. And what does he do? He starts the school in the cloud. And he has these self-organizing learning environments where kids come together and they study a big question. And then they get support from a person who's called a granny. And they give them Dweck-like feedback, and they learn stuff on their own. And anybody can be a granny. So there is such a thing now as the school in the cloud, and it really increases student achievement. So I would encourage you, when you're just after you find that Carol Dweck on YouTube, would you go to the story of the school in the cloud? It's 22 minutes, but it's an investment. It's quite provocative, and for a big question with encouragement and kids learning together with technology sounds a lot like exhibition to me, or any other PYP unit of inquiry. And so to me, that validates both the Dweck feedback and the PYP. All right. So you have in your handout collection there a purple sheet that is the Carol Dweck cheat sheet. And on one side it has teacher behaviors and strategies, and the other side are student behaviors and beliefs. And included on that sheet are things like, can you connect any of these teacher behaviors to PYP? Labeling students as gifted, smart, or slow? Hovering over students, or intervening when they get confused too soon? Or perhaps better, identifying difficult concepts and allowing students to grapple with them, using questions to extend learning. Providing a strategy-oriented feedback. I noticed you tried this, or you were thinking this way. What other approaches would you try? So the latter two are Dweck kinds of things. So on this sheet, you may notice, again, that a person with a fixed mindset would have a mastery response. So if something was difficult, you'd say, I haven't learned that yet. I will try harder. And a person with a fixed mindset might have a helpless response saying, I'm just no good at math. I give up. A performance goal is like a test or a summative assessment where you would measure something. And a learning goal is like formative feedback, where coaching perhaps. So like in a game, in practicing sport, it would be a learning goal, and that the game itself would be a performance goal. And learning tasks, again, are formative, and the performance tasks are summative. So as you're looking at that, this is how this is organized. So I am going to turn this over to Heather, who will help you understand this better.
Well, really, I don't know if I'll be helping you too much more, or rather guiding you to do a little deeper thinking of these three components of Dweck's research. You'll have noticed on your purple handout that you have 3 sticky notes, or Post-it notes, and I'd like you to think of any connections that you have made between these 3 components of Dweck's research and the PYP. That's right. On the back of this sheet with the Science House framework, you'll notice that there is the primary years program cheat sheet if you need a little prompting or guidance with your connections. We will be talking later about strategies to engage students and to always make sure we're promoting thinking and learning and collaboration. So that's what we're going to have you do here in the next few minutes. So I'd invite you to begin by making connections on your 3 sticky notes to the 3 different categories. So on one sticky note, make a connection that you have between the PYP and fixed versus growth mindset. On your second sticky note, make a connection between the PYP and the helpless response and mastery response. And on your third sticky note, make a connection between the PYP and the performance goals and learning goals. We'll give you a few minutes to do that. Go ahead, read through your purple sheet, your PYP cheat sheet, and then I'll give you the next directions. If you need a writing utensil or if you have additional connections, we have more sticky notes up here and writing utensils, so feel free to grab extra. All right, so you may have noticed some chart paper around the room, and in just a minute I will divide you into 3 different groups to work in these 3 different sections of the classroom. I guess it's kind of classroom. So some of you have pink sticky notes, some of you have green, and some of you have blue. And whatever the color of your sticky note is, we'd like you to start at that particular poster. You can put it up there, and we invite you to engage in some discussion with the others at that poster and talk about the connections you've made and how that, what their implications are at your school. And then we'll give you a few minutes there, and then we'll have you move to the next one, the green, and then the blue. So you'll stay within the same 3 posters, but start at the one that is the same color as your sticky note. So if you are on this side of the room, right to here by this pillar, we'll have you start at these 3 posters. If you're on this side to here, those 3, and then everyone else in the back, we'll have you start back here. So go ahead.
You're okay, man.
Situation. Now I got to click my mind. What is the situation that this client is everyone
If you haven't already, feel free to rotate to the next poster. We'll rotate to the right. So if you are on fixed and growth mindset, go ahead and rotate to the response, and then from there to the performance and learning goals.
So I think we ended up doing it right. We just kind of did a little bit. Right. So we got you.
Go ahead and rotate one last time. We'll wrap up here in just a couple minutes.
Okay, you can go back to your seats. I'm sorry we kind of rushed through that activity. Because we're a big group and we have a lot of things we want to get through. If we were doing something like that with our class, with our students, we would take a little more time. And thinking about it from an access and equity perspective, really trying to design it so that nobody could sit back and do nothing. And in this group, with this size, with the time that we had, that wasn't something that probably worked out very well. Maybe there were a couple of you that could sit back and just kind of watch. With our classes, though, we would try to really design it so that you had to participate. Just listening to some of the conversations, there's a range of experience in here with Dweck. Some people are very knowledgeable about Carol Dweck's work. Some people are just being introduced to it now. And there's also a range of experience with PYP. There are some people who have been working in PYP schools for many, many years, and some that are just starting their journey. So that conversation also has a lot of rich possibilities. There are a ton of PYP connections up there. I see a lot of attitudes and learner profile attributes and concepts, and basically almost every part of the PYP framework, there are connections being made.
All right. Well, so we're going to thank you so much for that. Thank you for engaging in that activity in your work. And I'm glad that you were also able to see the connection between the Science House work and our own. That's not right.
I also just wanted to mention briefly, those of you that are also working in MYP schools, this is something I just came across as I was looking through the new version of From Principles to Practice, which I think has got me really excited. Under their self-management skills revisions, this is their effective skills for self-management. There are a lot of Carol Dweck connections here, thinking about practicing failing well, dealing with change and things like that. So those of you that have some MYP connections can pull that out in your MYP schools too.
All right. We're going to look at the geography of identity. So one of the things in this lens is that you should think about your own identity and how you operate in the world. And so I'm wondering if any of these statements are familiar to you. Scissors come in all sizes, softball mitts help you catch a ball, subway tickets swipe easily, handshakes can sit next to anyone when you're eating. Or perhaps scissors don't cut well. Pens and pencils smear as you write. Cash machines are backwards. Subway tickets swipe on the wrong side. Writing is tricky. Filling in test bubbles is hard. That's an important skill. So if you identify with the purple, you're left-handed, and right-handed folks can identify with the green. Do I have any lefties in here? Ah, yes, thank you. So back in the day, I hear stories that people were slapped and forced to try to write with their right hand, and that there was some handedness discrimination. But if you are normal, and in this case right-handed, you have access to the power and dominance because you are part of the mainstream. You are dominant in the society at large. But those lefties, not normal, and they're defined as other, and they're non-dominant. And even though that handedness is something that we can, is accessible, is not as threatening, there are many other aspects to identity that would tend to make us other or to make us normal. So some of those aspects are race, ethnicity, disability, There are lots of them. And you have a geography of identity wheel in your packet. And this is an imperfect model to promote thinking about identity and our students' identity. And I'm going to ask, we're going to go through an example, a couple of examples. I don't know Colin Powell, but you can look him up on the internet and find out stuff about him, and so we're using him as an example. And so this is sort of the line, and this is the disadvantaged, and this is for advantaged. And each of these lines of the wheel, you can think about where he might be. So he's above the line in education. And his orientation, gender. It's, you know, most secretaries of state are male. Well, most of them. Class-wise, he was born in a neighborhood that was not great, but he certainly, class-wise, spirituality, he was age for his position, language, and job title. Race and ethnicity, probably below the line for what is expected. And so this is really contextual, and it's hard to do. And so I thought, well, let's be a risk taker, and I'm going to share my own wheel of identity, which is being a bit of a risk taker. So I'm looking at my education. I have a master's degree, so I'm above the line. There's lots of people that have a much better education than I do. Physical sensory stuff, you know, it's just not what it used to be. And so I'm below the line there. Orientation is, you know, societally, I suppose that could change now. Gender, most people in education is female, but I didn't put myself all the way at the top because there's so many administrators that are male. It's so context dependent. Class, ethnicity, you know, I'm not one of the 1%, but boy, I'm, you know, you look at if the world were a village, I'm doing pretty well. Spirituality, I have some funky ideas about that, so I put myself below the line. Language was tricky. I put myself below the line because as an IB educator in this context, I'm monolingual, and I just thought I would be above the line if I were bilingual. I don't know why I had cognitive emotional down there. I must have been having a funky day, but there it is. So all of this stuff is context dependent. Is it, you know, how you are in your job or how you might be out with your friends? But for your students, it's what is their identity in your classroom? And where are they advantaged or disadvantaged? And you start with looking at these things with yourself. So I'm going to ask you to take a minute and just look at doing a wheel of identity for yourself. Just take a minute and think about yourself as an educator. And where are you advantaged and where are you disadvantaged?
We also have on that model a couple of lines that are unlabeled. Because there may be something that you think about where yourself, where you had a lot of access to power, or you really felt othered in a category that's not included on there. So feel free to add that yourself too, to fill in those extra blank ones.
Okay, from the cheerful sounds, thank you for collaborating and sharing. I know that you don't have time to complete the whole wheel, but you can at least have had that experience. It's really complex and varied and fluid and context dependent. So, the Science Museum uses a process from the book called Focus Conversations, The Art of Focus Conversations, and it's called ORID, and it's a structured way to have either students or participants think about their work. So the first O is observational. What did you notice while you were doing the wheel? What new insights emerged as you developed your own identity? R is reflective. How has your thinking changed about identity, affected the way you think? Interpretive is the sort of the so what. How has thinking about identity affected how you think about the relationship between identity and privilege? And D generally is decisional, or in PYP it might be action. What are you going to do differently? What implications does this have for you as a teacher or a leader in your school? So I would like you to talk to a shoulder partner just for a few minutes, just using these questions. So as you started to think about this, did you have any insights? Did you have any change, and go through these questions? So we have just a few minutes for you to do that. Okay, thank you very much. All right, inquirers. Thank you. All right. I'm going to use my teacher voice pretty soon. Yeah, it does. It was work. I really appreciate the conversation and thinking about this. Our students will as well, because many of them feel othered in your classroom, and in the PYP we embrace each and every learner, and that's why the PYP model will be effective. And so I'm going to let Kirsten tell you about that next.
One thing I think a lot about with that identity wheel too is just the realization that identity is really a complex thing. And we can put labels on people so easily with one aspect of identity or another, but there's so many layers to it, and we all have that experience of being othered in one way or another. And really relating that experience to our kids can really help us as educators. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit and delve into another one of the lenses of the Science House model, and that's the lens on curriculum and pedagogy. And it's looking at things like culturally relevant curriculum and the way that we're teaching. And as a PYP teacher, that word relevant really stands out to me. Making the PYP happen says as we're working on our units to make them significant, relevant, engaging, and challenging. And in order to have our curriculum and pedagogy be really relevant, we have to know our students. We have to know what their identities are. We have to know who they are coming into the classroom. And we have to be really critical of the curriculum materials, the resources, the standards that we are using, because they all have bias and they all are missing perspectives. And so we have to think about, does my curriculum, do my standards, do the materials that I'm using connect to the identities of my students? And if they don't, what perspectives are missing? What else do I need to add to make sure that those connections are being made, so that those students that might feel othered if they're not being, that curriculum isn't relevant to them, we're making those connections and that relevancy. So that's all really interesting stuff. We're not going to get into that too much. But I want to really focus on the middle one here, that is complex instruction. And this is looking at the work of Elizabeth Cohen. Elizabeth Cohen has a book called Designing Group Work. She is a sociologist, so she looks at group work from a sociologist's perspective, that groups are made up of people and that there are relationships between those people, and it's those relationships that really have a big effect on the learning that's happening, on the achievement, on the access to the ideas in the classroom. So we do group work a lot in PYP classrooms. It's one of our standards. You have to group and regroup students for a variety of purposes. It's one of our transdisciplinary skills or approaches to learning in the social skills, that we want students to be working cooperatively. We want them to adopt a variety of roles. We want them to sometimes be leaders, sometimes be followers. It's a huge part of exhibition. When I'm working with teachers planning and reflecting on exhibition, it comes up every time. The groups, some of these groups work so well together, and some of them are completely dysfunctional, and how do I make the groups good? And, I see a lot of heads nodding out there. So it's really important for us to think about group work and how to do it well. So just think for yourself, those times that you've worked with groups, and this might be in your classroom, it might be also within staff development. Sometimes that it worked well, maybe sometimes that it didn't work well. I know I have a lot of experiences as a teacher of it not working well. And as you're thinking about that, I want to read a little bit from the preface of this book. She says, group work or cooperative learning is widely seen as a solution to many of the problems of instruction in heterogeneous classrooms. However, cooperative learning represents a difficult technical challenge in its own right. Many teachers have given up on the technique as a result of the problems they have experienced. So teachers ask questions like, what should I do when some of the groups are floundering or fighting with each other? How do I prevent students from getting burned out on small groups? How can I help those limited English proficient students participate within the group? What do I do when the good students are doing all the work? Or how do I prevent the wrap-up from being boring and a repetition of every group saying the same thing? So from an access and equity perspective, when we're thinking about group work, it's actually really risky to implement it very casually. It's risky to do it without really understanding some of the research behind it. It's risky to do it without understanding the technical skills to do it well. It can become a classroom management nightmare. And you can end up having some students that are doing all the work and all the thinking, and some students that are sitting back and doing nothing. And what happens then is that actually you have some students that are doing all the learning and some students that are not, and that's another way to really increase that achievement gap, those disparities. On the other hand, when we're doing group work really well, if we're implementing it really well, it can be a way that students learn concepts and ideas really effectively by working together, by arguing, by talking, by manipulating things, by tinkering. And it can be a way to actually give access to everybody the content at the same time, but you have to really know how to do it. And Cohen gives us a lot of ideas about how to do that. One of the things that she talks about is the role of status in group work. So she says, you know, anytime you have a group working together, there are some people in that group that are seen to have high status. And they're the students that we expect to do well. They're the ones that are doing a lot of the talking. They're the ones that have the materials more. They're the ones that have more influence when the group is trying to make decisions. They're often the ones that are credited with all the ideas, even if not all the ideas were theirs. And there are also students in a group that have low status. So thinking about kind of on the other side, they're the ones that are expected to do poorly. They talk less, they have less time to handle the materials, and consequently they learn less. And just referring back to that identity wheel that we just worked on a little bit, status can play out in lots of different ways. It's not just a race issue or a color issue, although that's part of it. It can also be an academic, you can have academic status in a classroom. If you're the good reader, you might have high status in that group depending on the task. Or if you're popular and with your peers, you might have high status in that group depending on the task. And there are also all those other layers of social constructs like ethnicity in our language and so on. We're going to show you a quick short clip that Cohen's research group made. Recorded. In this clip, you're going to watch 3 boys who are working together, making a list of things that they're going to take on an overnight camping trip. So their task is kind of to prioritize what things they're going to take. And as you're watching this, I want you to really see if you can notice who you think in the group has got high status and who you think might have lower status.
Just don't do anything with it yet.
Okay, how about
We don't need a,
we need a knife?
I just said.
Yeah or no?
No.
No? Just leave it? Or
Yeah, leave it home.
Okay.
Leave it home.
paper and ink, no sock?
Yeah, because if you get a wound or something, you just like
Saki?
in the John Wayne movies.
Okay. That. Cooking pans.
Need that.
For cooking koku. Flint and tinder, we want that, right?
Well, we gotta take out some.
How many do we have so far?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, let's pick out a fruit. No, we don't need umbrellas, definitely not.
No.
don't you think you got any fruit?
Fruit.
I'm hungry right now.
Well, we might need a knife more. Yeah, let's say
to kill
knife over
somebody?
fruit. Not kill somebody, kill some food if we get
Yeah, that's
hungry.
what I mean.
Okay, a knife. So
somebody,
we have our
okay.
10 things we want. Sandals. Money.
Why'd you do that? Why don't you just pass it out, Mike?
Let's watch this group again. See if you can keep track of just how frequently the person you think is high status talks and how frequently the low status person talks.
Leave it. Okay. Not yet. Don't do anything with it yet.
Okay, how about
We don't need a,
we need a knife?
I just said.
Yeah or no?
No.
No? Just leave it? Or
Yeah, leave it home. Leave it home.
paper and ink, no sock?
Yeah, because if you get a wound or something, you just like
Saki?
in the John Wayne movies.
Okay. That. Cooking pans.
Need that.
For cooking koku. Flint and tinder, we want that, right?
Well, we gotta take out some.
How many do we have so far?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, let's pick out a fruit. No, we don't need umbrellas, definitely not.
don't you think you got any fruit?
Fruit.
I'm hungry right now.
Well, we might need a knife more. Yeah, let's say
to kill
knife
somebody?
over fruit. Not kill somebody, kill some food if we get
Yeah, that's
hungry.
what I mean.
Okay, a knife.
Kill
So
somebody,
we have our
okay.
10 things we want. Sandals. Money.
Why'd you do that? Why don't you just pass it out, Mike?
Okay, so just take a minute or two to talk to somebody next to you about what you saw, maybe any connections that you made to your own schools or practice.
didn't expect that.
I remember the first time I watched that video, it made such a big impact on me. I was like, whoa, I've seen that in my own classroom too. And it's kind of heartbreaking. You might think that that's an isolated experience for the young boy who was excluded in that video, and you might grow out of feeling isolated. But in fact, a lot of times these issues continue into adulthood, and often students that are seen to have low status in groups become adults that still experience these status issues. And as they get older, these experiences can have even larger impacts on their lives and on the lives of their children. So what do we do about it? And I would really recommend you to take a look at Cohen's book at some point if you haven't done that. She gives a lot of really good strategies and some ideas for ways to do this a little bit better. She says that we can confer status in a group when a high status individual recognizes a low status individual. And teachers in a classroom are usually have pretty high status. So one of our jobs is to really be paying attention to what's happening with that status, and to recognize maybe when students that do have a lower status are making a really intellectual, meaningful contribution, to really recognize that. Some of the ways that we can really notice status are really subtle cues, like really noticing those eye contact cues and body language cues and voice cues, and using our own subtle cues also to either enhance or deflect status. That we should, in our classrooms, establish and teach group norms. And saying these kinds of things and these beliefs over and over and over again really can make a difference. So this is things like, we all have something to learn here, and we all have something to contribute. And things like, we need to make space for everybody's voice here. And no one of us is good at everything, and every one of us is good at something. And we all have the right to ask for help. And we all have the duty to assist if we're asked. And assisting doesn't mean doing it for them. It means helping and showing and showing how. Things like that, saying those kinds of things over and over really can make a big difference. That when we do have groups working together, part of our job as educators is to really consider them always very, very carefully. I know a lot of times I would often, when I made groups, would say, okay, I want to make sure I have a really strong student in each group. And sometimes that's a good thing, but sometimes it's not, because those students take over. So grouping and regrouping in lots of different ways, and mixing it up frequently. When you have tasks, to really think about making sure that every person in the group needs to participate in order for it to happen. And that there's ways to structure group work to make that happen. And often compressing the amount of time they have to complete a task is one way to do that.
And in this video situation, to get the students to recognize it themselves, when they completed their list, you can write their name next to their contribution, and they can see that student gets to contribute.
Absolutely. Making those things really visible. And then she talks a lot also about group roles and the difference between procedural roles and intellectual roles. So that might be the difference between a note taker, the note taker is doing all the writing and all the thinking and all the learning, and a note prompter who's making sure that everybody's writing notes as we're going along and making sure everybody's helping out and doing the learning. The procedural group roles, she talks a lot about how those roles relate to how the work gets done, not what's getting done. So those might be things like a facilitator, somebody who's making sure that all the tasks that you've assigned are getting completed, or a timekeeper, or an equity manager to make sure everybody's participating, or a reporter that reports back to the group at the end. She gives examples in her book of what some of those might be. She also says it's really important to assign roles. Oops, I'm going too far here. To assign roles, because if you let the students in the group choose the roles, often it's the roles that are seen to be as high status are given to the students that are seen to have a high status. So making sure that you're rotating those really regularly, that every student has a chance at some point to practice every one of those roles. And that you can rotate those in a really visible way. Often it's nice to have a little badge or a clothespin so that you also as a facilitator can make sure that people are doing the roles that they are assigned. Making them public, writing little job descriptions. Basically, one of the big ideas here is that you want to make sure all the students are talking, all the students are handling materials, all the students are engaged, and there's not a possibility to opt out of it. And this kind of leads into what Heather's going to share. She's going to share some practical teaching strategies that we've tried out in our classrooms too.
After I attended the science workshop last summer, I went back and was very energized and ready to dig in, but also overwhelmed. There was a lot of information that we learned in just 3 short days, and I thought, okay, now how do I do this all? And I got back to my classroom and I realized I was doing a lot of these things already, and a lot of the ways that I structured my groups and a lot of the activities I planned actually ensured access and equity for students. So I just want to share a few of those strategies with you. As I was planning this, I realized that I had not only just small group strategies, but also whole groups, so things you could do with your whole class, things that you could do a combination of. Some of these strategies would work for a whole group or just for a small group. And then I also included some thinking strategies, which could translate into, or they could be used in combination with some of the group strategies. So I often, or I may refer to these as interaction strategies, because that's what a lot of them are. Students are interacting with each other. They are speaking, they are listening, they are thinking, they are learning. We do a lot of collaboration at our school, and we have a high EL population. So we often collaborate as a grade level with our EL teacher, with our special ed teacher. So I will often refer to these, or talk about these with using the word we, and we do really collaborate to develop the activities that we do. You may or may not be familiar with some of these strategies. As I was, preparing this presentation, I was trying to think about it from more than just a second grade perspective. How could this translate to older students or younger students? And the ideas just started flowing. So I invite you, wherever you are on your journey and whatever background knowledge you may have of these strategies, to stretch your thinking and think about how it might apply to your school or your classroom. These are listed on the blue handout that you have, and I will talk about them in the order that they are listed. I'll start with the group strategies and then move into the thinking strategies. I've included websites that give additional information or directions. They are very long, so if you would prefer this electronically, you can just send me an email. I'm Heather, and I'm happy to send it to you, or you can just click on the link and get there a little bit faster. I also have hard copies of several of these strategies in the back of the room on the table, so you're welcome to take a look at any of those after the session. So here we go. As I said, you could do a lot of these strategies in small groups with pairs. I'm going to start by talking about Kagan's cooperative learning structures. Can I just see a raise of hand or a show of hands who are familiar with Kagan's cooperative learning structures? Okay. That was something I didn't know. I don't know my audience very well, so I don't want to give you information that you know, but as I said, I invite you to stretch your thinking and think of other ways you could use these. These are very structured, so everyone has a role. Students rotate throughout each role, so they are getting access and to the materials and to the activity. These are very flexible when you are designing them. You could create the questions, you could have students create the questions, you could have a combination of teacher-created questions and student-created questions. They are very beneficial for English language learners. They promote thinking, speaking, listening, reading, and then in turn, that promotes learning. So the first one is quiz, quiz, trade. And this is an activity where you could do, I often use it with my whole class, but you could split them into smaller groups. I have pictures of a couple of the cards that kids have. So every single student gets one of these cards. They fold it up so that the question is on the outside and then the answer's in the center. So everybody has their card, and they pair up with another student, and one child begins, and they ask the question on the card. They can see it, and then their partner can see it as well. So that's why we've designed it so the question is on both sides. The other child answers. The student who asks the question gives feedback, and that's really big with Kagan. Giving feedback, praising, responding is a big part of that. I've taught my students, if they don't get the answer, ask them to try again, maybe give them a helpful suggestion. And if they do get it right, praise them. Then the other student goes, they ask their question, they answer, they give them feedback, and then they trade cards. So they have now become an expert on their card that they started with and the other card. They raise their hand, and they walk around the classroom, and they find someone else whose hand is raised, and then they repeat the process. So you can do this for any amount of time. I've encouraged my students to give a partner a high five when they find someone, and to partner up with someone they haven't been partners with already. Next is fan and pick. So students work in groups of 4 with this strategy. This is a mat that we found on, I believe it was on Teachers Pay Teachers. The source is at the bottom, and I brought the hard copy. It's in the back of the classroom. But I like this because it gives each role on the actual mat. So how this works is the first student will hold the question cards, and we've actually used the same template and cards that we've used for Quiz Trade. They work very well for this. And they fan them out, and child number 2 picks a card and reads the question. They're reading that to the student who is with role number 3. They answer the question, and in the meantime, student 2 is passing the card to student 4, and they check the answer, praise, or give feedback. Then students stay where they are, and they just rotate the mat. So student 1 now becomes student 2, and so on. So kids don't need to move throughout this. They are all doing all of these roles throughout the entire activity. Showdown is another strategy that I use quite often. There's many variations of this. I often do it whole group as a quick formative assessment to see where kids are. They all have materials. They all have a pen or a pencil or a marker. I often use it with whiteboards. You could do it in small groups where students have specific question cards, so then they can check answers and rotate roles. But basically, you just ask students a question, pose a math problem, and give them time to answer it. They hold their boards close to them or cover them up, and then I often give a countdown, 3, 2, 1, and then when I say showdown, they show their answer. I've also done this with vocabulary words, and so they have cards in front of them, and I might pose a picture, a definition, and then they hold up the vocabulary word. I've also done it with nonfiction text features. So I show an example of a nonfiction text feature, and then they choose the card that is that particular feature. So it stretches across content areas: math, language arts, and science. You have all participated in a version of Jot Thoughts. I use this quite often in many different ways. Students may jot their thoughts down on a sticky note. They might have their own little piece of paper where they jot their thoughts down. It's a great way for kids to elicit their prior knowledge of a particular topic or review a topic. It's very open-ended. It can be structured or designed many different ways. If kids don't have their own paper, their own sticky notes, maybe they're carouseling around some posters, so maybe we were using these 3 and kids were working in a small group. I might have them pass the pen as they rotate to each poster or question so that someone isn't always writing. They have a chance to share, but they're also talking and thinking and discussing. After kids have done their jot thoughts or written down their answers, I often like to have them carousel around the classroom too and read what other students have thought about and answered, or to do that at the beginning before they start answering a question on a particular poster. Talking chips is another Kagan strategy. I often use these in small groups and particular guided reading groups. And they work well to use with a learning cube. So if we were having a discussion on a book that we read and we had a cube that had different questions on all sides, the students might take turns rolling the cube, and then they all receive one chip, or they could receive multiple chips. And a student would roll the cube, and we'd ask the question. And depending on if the question allows for multiple answers, when students are ready to answer, they'll just slide their chip forward to let the group know that they're ready, and they'll give their answer. And you wouldn't move on and ask the next question until all students have shared their answer, and they let you know that by moving their talking chip. Otherwise, it can be a little more open-ended, where students receive 3 talking chips at the beginning of the group, and by the time you're done, they should all have answered 3 different times and just slid it towards the center when they're ready. This picture is an example of the talking chips that we received from the Science House last summer, but I've also seen teachers use poker chips for this as well. Next, I have just a variety of other strategies. I really didn't know what to call these. They're just random strategies. Again, they can be used whole group, with small groups, in pairs. Students are engaged with these strategies. They have access to the materials, which means they have access to thinking and speaking, listening, possibly reading, writing, and then learning. And again, these can be used across multiple content areas. Dip and strip is something I use quite often and can be used in many, many different ways. It's basically a paper bag with a picture of a jar and the tape to the front of it, and you can put anything inside the bag. With second graders, there's, something special in not knowing what you're gonna get when you dip your hand into the bag. But to give you a few examples of how I've used this, I often use it with sorts, and usually start them out very open. For example, I did, when we were studying genres, I printed off a bunch of pictures of book covers that we had read as a class and put them all in the bag. And I usually like to do this with pairs of students, sometimes groups of 3, but no bigger than groups of 3. So if it's a pair, they just take turns dipping something out of the bag. And so they'd take turns dipping something out of the bag, the strip or the card. And they started by looking at all the pictures of the books in the bag and figuring out what they all have in common or how they're different, and they sort them how they want, and then it gets a little more guided and structured, and the teacher asks questions to narrow the focus. Also done this in science with animal classifications, with picture cards of animals and words that describe classifications. We've also used it very specifically with ED word endings and the sounds that those make. In the back, I do have a sorting mat for literary elements. So when we were studying that reading skill, they all had a sorting mat in front of them, and they would dip different strips out that had different literary elements, and they had to decide where they would go on the mat. Was it the problem? Was it a solution? Was it an event? And I've structured that so sometimes groups have all the cards filled out, sometimes they draw blank ones and they have to add something to it. I have who has is a strategy you could use as a whole class or a smaller group. So this is an example of an I have who has game with time. So all students have a card, all cards are different. You want to make sure that the question that's asked cannot have multiple answers or else it will not work out, which I learned very quickly. But you choose a student to go first, and they actually start by reading the question at the bottom of the card. So for example, this one's time, and it would start by saying, who has 550? And so they'd all look at the picture in their card, and if their clock shows 550, they would say, I have 550, and then who has 1021? And if it's done correctly, by the time the last student asks their question, the answer should be the first student who started. But I like this because it encourages kids to really listen and to think and to visualize and to speak. Inside-outside circle is something that can be used in conjunction with a lot of different things. It could be very structured or it can be very open-ended. It can go across multiple content areas. I've used it with the quiz trade card so that students can both see the answer, or read the question, and then they have the answer. Basically, students make two circles. One is on the outside, and then one is on the inside. Students face each other. They either ask the question on their card, they might share their thinking, and then the teacher gives directions, okay, inside circle, move one to your left, or two to your right, or outside circle, do the same. So it gets kids up on their feet and moving and interacting with one another. Snowball fight is a fun one, especially in Minnesota. You could do this as a whole class or in small groups. Students all begin with a piece of paper. It is very open-ended. It goes across multiple content areas. I've included some examples here. You could use it with fact and opinion, complement lists, jot thoughts, synonyms. So I'll start with fact and opinion. That was one of the most recent ones I've done. So I had taught the students the difference between a fact and an opinion. They all received a piece of paper. I presented a topic, and half the kids had to write a fact about the particular topic, and half had to write an opinion statement. And then the fun comes when they, especially the first time you do this, and they get the directions to crumple their paper up like a snowball. And then you give directions to throw the snowball. And so they all throw it, and then they find another piece of paper. They pick it up, they open it, and in this case, they had to just read the statement on their paper and decide if that was a fact or an opinion statement. And then they sorted themselves accordingly. These last few, I'm just going to buzz through pretty quick. These are thinking strategies that are all very open-ended. They work well with some of these interaction or cooperative learning strategies I just discussed. They are done by Harvard Project Zero. They encourage students to think about multiple perspectives, and as I said, they're very open-ended. 3-2-1 bridge is the first one. You could use this to activate prior knowledge on a particular topic. You could use it to review a topic or a unit. Students make connections with this thinking strategy. So the teacher poses a topic or a question. Students jot down 3 thoughts or ideas, 2 questions, and 1 analogy. So I could see this with an inside-outside circle where students have their thoughts, and then they'd get into a circle and then share any of the following. CSI, color, symbol, image. So again, it's very open-ended, and after reading about a particular topic or listening or viewing or watching something, students kind of make some connections and they stretch their thinking and they choose a color that represents that idea, a symbol, and an image. I used to think, but now I think is basically what that is. It's used for reflection, very open-ended. It encourages students to think about multiple perspectives. Think, pair, share is something I use very often. It can be used with any of those thinking strategies. It's quick, it's easy. In my classroom, I use the word elbow buddy to do most of our think, pair, share. So students share their thinking with an elbow buddy, and I like to do it before I open up the question for a whole class discussion, because it gets kids to do a little thinking and discussion first, and then allows us to have a more meaningful class discussion. Sometimes I assign 1 and 2s to pairs, so that one student isn't always doing all the talking, twos, share your thoughts about this, and then for the next question, okay, ones. I also like to switch it up sometimes, and instead of having students share out their own thinking, have them share their partner's thinking instead. So that really encourages them to listen to what their partner has to say. All right. We were going to have you do a little application with this, but it looks like we are short on time. So I will turn it over to Kirsten to wrap up.
Just a couple of things. I know we're out of time here, but just to remember that we are not in this access and equity thing alone, that this is something that has to happen in community. It has to happen in collaboration and cooperation. It is who we are, is a big part of the IB and our identity, that it's important to share your stories and to listen to the stories of others. In order to close that gap, we also need to be taking action. So thinking about our responsibility to do what is important and to make those changes, and to really strive for that change in our schools and our classrooms to make sure that all students have access to the learning. And as IB schools, IB is the vehicle for this. I mean, this is the pieces are already in the IB framework. The lens, IB is the lens through which we envision our curriculum and our instruction, and that if we're doing those components with fidelity and really thinking about it, they can make a huge change. And one of the big ideas in PYP, of course, is that it's inclusive, that we are really thinking about reaching all of our students. We thank you so much for spending this time with us. One last thing, there is another workshop at the Science Museum that's looking at that framework. If any of you are close, I know it's coming up really fast, but if you're interested, I have a couple flyers up in the front. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.